Good morning, everyone. My name is Julia Hooperage, and I'm an MBA student here at Columbia Business School. Before we continue, I just wanted to give two announcements. Thank you. Before we continue, I just wanted to give two announcements. First, we have a full house, so please do not leave bags and personal stuff on the chairs, and please try to not to leave empty space between you. So, from what we've heard in this first panel, the global challenges facing decarbonization are huge, as are the opportunities for private sector action to ensure the green transition. In this second panel, Brazil's leading role as a solution hub for climate change, we will discuss why Brazil can be this hub of solutions to climate-related challenges. We will explore how the private sector can help foster and accelerate the solutions, not only for Brazil, but for the whole world, which represent business opportunities for an economy in transition. For this panel, I call to the stage Bruce Usher, professor and faculty director at the Columbia Business School, Natalie Unterstell, president of the Talanoa Institute, Mark Wiseman, senior advisor at BCG, and to mediate, I invite Luciana Antonini Ribeiro, founding partner at EB Capital. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. We had an amazing panel about decarbonization and the road. And now I think it's a very good moment for us to discuss how we are going to get deeper in terms of global and Brazil. So as a first question that I have to all of you, and I would love to hear your thoughts, we all are aiming to reach net zero economies. And different countries are playing different roles, each one with different challenges and opportunities. In your view, what role Brazil could play as a provider of solutions in a net zero economy? And Bruce, if you can start with this one, I would love.
Okay. Thank you very much, Luciana. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start with a little bit of big picture, if that's okay, and then I'll get to Brazil in a moment. I started working on climate change solutions 20 years ago, 2002, as an investor and leading businesses in the sector, and became an academic. And my colleague, Kostis Miglaris, just called me out a few minutes ago about the program here at Columbia. And I think what I've seen over the last 20 years is a fundamental misunderstanding of where we are at addressing climate change. And by that I mean, 20 years ago, we had a very good understanding of the science of climate change. The science was already pretty advanced. We understood what the problem was, and we knew what we had to do to address it. But in fact, we didn't have any solutions to climate change. There were no technologies available that would allow us to transition our global economy to a net zero economy. Renewable energy was enormously expensive and not at scale. Electric vehicles essentially didn't exist. They were golf carts. There was no green hydrogen. There was nothing. 20 years later, here in 2022, we're in a remarkably different situation because of innovation, mostly innovation in technologies, but also innovation in business processes. We actually have technologies today that are competitive with the incumbent polluting technologies, mostly renewable energy and electric vehicles, that can take us halfway to net zero globally. We actually have half the solutions we need. And the other half are in development. They're being funded by venture capitalists. They're out there. Direct air capture, green hydrogen, and all sorts of other technologies that'll get us most of the other half we need. Now, why are people so negative on the situation today? And they have a right to be so. Because we're now starting to see the impacts of climate change. 20 years ago, the physical reality of climate change hadn't really become apparent. There was very little evidence physically. It was more in theory. Today, we see the physical evidence. In Brazil alone, you see areas of drought that didn't exist. You see areas of intense rain and creating dramatic mudslides and such in the past year and elsewhere globally. So that physical reality is coming home, and that's getting people very worried. Reasonably so. And secondly, in the past 20 years, emissions have gone up, not down, and that window to get to zero is now down to somewhere between 30 and 50 years. The best climate science says we have to get to net zero by 2050 to 2070 to avoid catastrophic climate change, a warming of more than 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. So the situation today, on the one hand, we have a much tighter window, and there's a lot to be very worried about. On the other hand, and this is where the misunderstanding lies, we are better positioned to address climate change today than ever, and much better than when I got into this 20 years ago. So businesses have these solutions at hand. There's something they can now work with. Will they actually implement the solutions at scale? Because at the end of the day, that's all that matters. And the good news here is they're starting to. And they're not starting to because it's out of the goodness of their heart. They're starting to because they're feeling three very significant pressures. That first pressure is from their own employees. Employees show a marked desire to work for companies that they believe are sustainable. And we have academic research here at the university that has evidence of that. They're feeling pressure from consumers. Consumers are showing a marked preference for products they believe are sustainable. And lastly, they're getting pressure from investors, from the ESG investing community and other investors who are looking for companies they believe have a plan to reduce emissions to net zero. So those pressures are pushing companies in the right direction. What does that mean specifically? And I'm going to get to Brazil in 1 second, then I want to pass it on very briefly. When we think about what are the opportunities for businesses, they really fall into two categories. They're the climate solutions that are already commercial, and the opportunity and the challenge is to get them to scale. And that's essentially renewable energy and electric vehicles today. And then there are the solutions that are not yet commercial, and it's all about innovation. And business is really good at both. Business is great at scaling, and business is great at innovation. But different businesses are good at different things. And every business needs to think about where does their strength lie, and which of those two groups are they going to compete in and how. Specific to Brazil, I think there are three very obvious areas of opportunity and perhaps many more. One is obviously in carbon capture, especially through nature-based solutions, but also possibly through direct air capture. So that's an obvious one. And that's competitive at scale today. We just need to do a lot more of it. The other two areas that are more on the innovation side are green hydrogen, which Arthur mentioned in the previous panel. Why Brazil and green hydrogen? Because Brazil's grid is already pretty clean. 78%, I believe, is generated from clean resources. And green hydrogen, you first need clean electricity to create green hydrogen. You need cheap green electricity. And Brazil does have that today, and ideally will have more in the future. So that's an opportunity, that's a competitive advantage for Brazil. And then the other area is in biofuels, particularly SAF, sustainable aviation fuels. Brazil's by far the leader in biofuels globally through its production of ethanol, and is positioned to be a leader in SAF if it wishes to do so. Again, that's not competitive yet, but that's an opportunity in the future. Let me stop there.
Mark, I would love to hear, you're a global investor, but you have a very interesting take as well in Brazil. Can you tell a little bit about it?
Well, thank you. And, you know, I think, again, similar to what Bruce said and what was commented on in the previous panel, I think investors today are beginning to understand that financing the transition, it's not about, you know, doing something because it's the right thing to do, or because the regulator says to do it, or because the stakeholders say to do it. It's actually probably the greatest investment opportunity in our lifetime. And I've been at this investment business for a long time. And so we have to understand that the real opportunity here is to create the conditions to attract capital to finance the very things that Bruce is talking about. And so creating those conditions actually doesn't just require a market opportunity, be it in green hydrogen or sustainable aviation fuel, et cetera, but it also means that you need the legal structures, the regulation, and the capital markets to support that, that form of investment. So for me, the opportunity for Brazil is tremendous. But the opportunity for Brazil has been tremendous for investors for a long time. It just hasn't materialized, right? We've been talking about, go back to the BRICS, right? The first one was Brazil. And so here again, Brazil, because of its natural endowments, where it's placed in the world, the types of resources it has, particularly as it relates to renewable energy, has an incredible opportunity to take the lead in this new revolution. The question for me is, will it create the conditions to allow global capital to flow and make a profit on a risk-adjusted basis from that opportunity? And very simply, I think as we think about climate transition, if I had to give you one sentence from an investor's perspective of how we have to start thinking about this, is that financing the transition or thinking about sustainable finance has to move from PowerPoint slides to spreadsheets. We have to be in a position today, and the math works. The math works. But we have to be in a position today where we're thinking about these projects as presenting to the global capital markets an attractive risk-adjusted return on that capital. And capital is an amazing thing. If you get that right and you can prove out that you can make an appropriate risk-adjusted return, including having a regulatory environment that gives assurance to investors that they're going to get that return back, then the world will beat a path to your door. So for me, the question is not just for Brazil, but beyond. I happen to be Canadian, and we face some of the same challenges in Canada because we have some of the same endowments. Can Brazil create the conditions that will marry those natural endowments and those natural advantages with the types of capital structures and market solutions that will allow capital to beat a path to its door? So you need both things. And I think it's fantastic that we can think about Brazil and other places as having these endowments that ought to be attractive. But if you don't have the fundamental structures in place and you can't sort of build a model on a spreadsheet that is going to create that risk-adjusted return, it's all theoretical. So I'll stop there. We can get more.
Thank you, Mark, very much. Natalie, you are a pioneer in the discussion of climate. Would love to hear your thoughts on this first question.
Thank you, and I think you're calling me a pioneer because I'm 38 years old and I've been working on this for 20, so it's really a long time already. But first of all, I completely agree with Bruce that we are in a very different situation. We left that blame game that we had in the past, which was about like who's going to pay for the transition, who's going to do it, and who's going to, just sit behind and kind of watch. This is behind us, and fundamentally because in 2015, the world was able to agree on the Paris Agreement, right? And from 2015 onwards, we saw that a lot of low-carbon technologies are picking up from wind and solar, which are really like quadrupling all over, to batteries and so on. So this is happening, right? And of course, we still need to see more acceleration, and I think that's also the case for Brazil. But there's another piece which is even, it's also part of all of this net zero future, which is really about us, which is the reversion of deforestation. So we won't get to net zero, the world won't get to net zero if we do not transform our relationship with nature. And we are protagonists of that, meaning that, like it or not, we will have to do it. And there is something here which I have to say, which being a protagonist is different from being a leader. So Brazil is a protagonist on that because of our natural endowments, yes. But for years, I would say decades, we've been trying to hide that, to sort of treat the Amazon rainforest as a liability. It's something we don't want to talk about. it's a problem, right? And the point is then that the world is kind of putting us on a very difficult situation and say, hey, if you don't do it, nobody will do it for you. So come on, step up and do whatever is needed. And in that sense, if we want to become leaders, we will have to do our homework, and we will have to open ourselves to have followers. What I mean by that, there are many other countries which are nature-rich, which are mega diverse, like Brazil, and that we can work with. We can export technologies to them. And look, in the past, we were very courageous, right? In the 70s, in the 80s, in the 2000s, we created the first forest monitoring system, which is PRODES in INPE. We created the Embrapa to work on agriculture. I think now it's time for us to show the same courage and the same leadership, you know, to exercise all of this. And just one thing that calls my attention, and it's a process that is unfolding at this very moment, is that Brazil is trying to become a member of the OECD club, right? And interestingly enough, the OECD has no tradition whatsoever in the green agenda. All the norms, all the policies that are part of the OECD framework, they were shaped for the brown agenda. They were shaped for industrial economies, right? So when Brazil decided to start the accession process and try to become an OECD member, that, I think, was a sort of seismic shift because the OECD had to start thinking about the green agenda. And what I mean by that, and it's unfolding right now, the OECD proposed this roadmap for Brazil. Brazil is now having to respond to all of this, but the fundamental thing here is that Brazil may not only, you know, be a provider of goods and services and solutions in that sense to a green economy, but also become a norm setter. We can become the ones that are, for instance, an OECD member and are going to shape the future norms and the future regulations. I think we have to really, you know, lead in the sense of proposing this new generation of public policies that we are going to be aligned with the Paris Agreement and that will respond to how we should treat nature based on our own assets.
Very inspiring. Thank you, Natalie. Bruce, you are about to launch a new book. Congratulations on that. Investing in the Era of Climate Change. I'm excited to read it. And from what I heard, you write there about technology and the impact of technology that mitigates the climate change and how it reflects on businesses and in investors. Can you talk a little bit about it and the major trends that you see right now in investing?
So the book is about investing in these trends that are channeling a great deal of capital into these solutions. And those trends, actually, I touched on in my opening remarks, which is around employees, consumers, and businesses being pushed in this direction, and the capital is now finding that's where the opportunity is lying. Specific to Brazil, there are two issues I think I want to highlight in detail given our limited time here, because I think the opportunity is extraordinary given the amount of capital flowing this way and the unique attributes that Brazil has that we've talked about. But there are two really major challenges, and I think it's important everyone's aware of. The potential for nature-based solutions in Brazil, primarily Amazon, but beyond the Amazon too, can really only be, when we say monetized, the economic value can only be captured and maintain that through some sort of market mechanism. And the obvious mechanism is carbon credits. Carbon credits put an economic value on leaving trees standing instead of cutting them down. The challenge here is we do not have a global carbon credit market. We have dozens, if not hundreds, of small fractured markets. And those markets are almost entirely voluntary today. And this creates a real potential for abuse in the system. Under the Paris Agreement, there is a framework called Article 6 to make the carbon markets cohesive globally and allow credits to be traded internationally and the like, and that's a good thing, and that's an ongoing series of negotiations. But today, and perhaps for many years in the future, those markets will still be very disconnected and not well regulated, and you don't have the force of law to really make them effective. So the first thing I would say is the opportunity is clearly there. The capital is there. The regulatory mechanism around carbon credits does not exist today, and I have some grave concerns about when or if we will get that. The second area is the technologies that I write about and talk about, starting with renewable energy and electric vehicles and things like green hydrogen. These are all physical products. They are infrastructure products, and it's important to keep that in mind. Essentially what we've got going on here is we spent 300 years building a global economy, a physical economy of factories and roads and everything else. And it's worked out really well. I mean, in the sense that we've created a lot of abundance of food and ability to transport and everything else. But as you all know, the catch was it's unsustainable because of greenhouse gas emissions. So now we have to rebuild that entire global economy that was created over 300 years in 30 years. And all these technologies are about rebuilding. So the concern is, in Brazil and many other countries, including the US, it's really hard to build stuff. It's hard to build stuff. That's a technical term, right? Stuff. It's hard to build things because of regulatory barriers. So on the one hand, I say we have to have regulation for carbon credit markets. On the other hand, it's very difficult to get projects built and constructed quickly. There's a hydro project. They're trying to bring clean hydro from Quebec, we're originally both Canadian, down here to New York City to get clean power into New York City. That project has been under development for 17 years, not because of technology, but because of the regulatory process to get approved. In Brazil, I think there are some advantages in the regulatory, and there's some big challenges to getting things built.
Just on the regulatory front, first of all, jump in for a second. First of all, you're 100%, as a practitioner, I can tell you're 100% right on the carbon credit market. And there's as we all know, there's the further complication, not just sort of some form of assurance, but also abatement versus avoidance, and that debate continues, and that's got to be sorted out. And that has a big impact on nature-based solutions in particular. I'll put a bit of a positive spin from a couple perspectives on let's call it the permitting side of things. Necessity is the mother of invention, and it's also the mother of pushing governments to ultimately do the right thing and a little bit more quickly. So a couple of just examples to sort of put a bit of a positive spin on it and maybe give us some form of optimism. First of all, the horrific events in Ukraine and the impact that's had on particular European energy markets has shown when there's necessity, governments will move. And the speed at which the transition is taking place in continental Europe to move away from the reliance on Russian gas is extraordinary, even in the last 6 months. And projects are being approved, and green hydrogen contracts are being signed, and things are moving. So, the old saying, never waste a crisis. At some level, there's hope, particularly in Europe, to show that the regulators, when there is a crisis, will actually move, to use another technical term, get shit done, when they've shown no proclivity to do it in normal circumstances. So that's the first positive point. The second positive point is that the private sector is seeing more and more of this opportunity and finding innovative ways to move and finance. Now, it still requires government, but it requires less government than it has traditionally. And there's an extraordinary transaction, not around climate, but I actually think it's going to extend to climate transition, that was announced about 3 weeks ago. And it's a $30 billion project to build a semiconductor fab by Intel in Arizona that's being financed almost entirely by private capital and actually by private infrastructure capital. And it was done unbelievably quickly. Again, because there's a need to reshore semiconductor capacity, and there's government willingness to do it, but it was actually a commercial opportunity that drove it. The shortage of microchips drove that $30 billion of capital. That same type of need is going to start to exist, whether it's around EV battery production, whether it's around onshoring of photovoltaic capacity, whether it's the building of wind turbines or other areas that require reasonably little government permission to get it done, and it will be done by private capital. So I actually am quite hopeful that necessity will actually help push through some of these things. First of all, with government, or quite simply, finding ways to go around government. So for instance, it's a lot easier to build photovoltaic capacity or wind capacity than it is run-of-river hydro, because you just need less government permission. And so that's where we're moving in terms of the type of green energy that's going to be utilized to, for example, run electrolyzers to produce green hydrogen, et cetera. So I'm actually reasonably hopeful that both capital and government, as it becomes a little bit more obvious that we got to get this done in 30 years, not 300. There's some good signs coming out of unfortunate circumstances.
Thank you for the positive spin. I love it. And let me build on that. Natalie, you guys have led a very interesting initiative that's a coalition called Climate and Development, where you guys have identified potential areas where Brazil could lead in the decarbonization and could also transition to a greener economic model. So let's go to Brazil. Tell us a little bit more about this project.
Yeah, and first of all, let me acknowledge that many people that are part of this climate and development platform are here today. So Marcelo, Renata, many others that I see here. So it's really a movement, a coalition of coalitions, I would say, encompassing a lot of sectors and so on. But let me share the reason why we got together and what are the proposals. So Brazil lacks a strategy for its own transition, okay? And although we like to brag that, oh, we are relatively cleaner than other countries, particularly in the energy sector, in the power sector, still like our emissions are growing. The trend is that they continue to grow. And very alarming, I would say, we are launching a study today, both here and in Paris and Rio simultaneously, showing that in a path of continuity of the current policies that have been adopted, particularly because of deforestation, but also because of decisions that were made around securing 8 gigawatts of new fossil-powered power plants. Brazil would get to 2030 with 137% more emissions than what we have committed to before the Paris Agreement. So it's really about, not going down, not showing ambition or integrity, but going up. These numbers are new, as I said. They were produced by COPE UFRJ, the Rio de Janeiro University, a brilliant group of researchers led by Professor Emílio Lahovere. And it's really about, how do we then break this trend? Because it's not acceptable. That's not what we want. And if we go into this direction, I'm sure that we are not going to be leaders, positive leaders, but negative leaders, right? Show the wrong example, and that's what we don't want. So trying to think about how to break this trend and, moreover, to recognize that there is an ecosystem of actors in Brazil that are innovating, that are committed to net zero. We hold the space, these different coalitions, for 300 actors, from political leaders like governors, mayors, senators, to community leaders, indigenous leaders, and experts to really think about a shared direction of travel, one that could be good for our people and for the planet, right? And what we learned in this process, which was about building scenarios and, you know, discussing what is politically feasible to do, was that Brazil has a strong capacity to transform very quickly. So in comparison with the number that I just shared with you, which is setting, you know, us in a very wrong direction, the opportunity space is huge. We can get to 2030 with around 80% of emissions reductions, 80%. And this is without any new technological breakthrough at a low cost, and doing basically like a adjusting the policy incentives. So which other country can do that, can get to 80%? Of course, we have a range there from 63 to 80, but anyhow, it's really about like not only thinking about being bold, but having the conditions, and as you said, we can do it. Then the point is how. So we translated all of these numbers and the conversations that took place for months into a 10-point plan. And I see Susana Kerr here. Susana was also part of that conversation, our former Secretary of Climate Change in the Ministry of the Environment. And this 10-point plan has been presented to all presidential candidates in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And what we said to them was the following: look, it's not about a shopping list. It's not about, oh, I'm going to focus on carbon pricing, but I'm not going to take care of the forests. Or the opposite, right? Oh, no, I'm just going to do command and control measures in the rainforest, and I'm not going to do carbon pricing. No, it's a package. It should be seen as a package, and we need to move, smoothly in all of these areas, from sanitation, which is an important one for development, right? That we can do with high or low emissions, to, of course, putting a price on carbon and restoring at least 4 million hectares of forests within this decade. So it's out there, it's a package, and the way we see it is one where we are going to mobilize capital, we're going to send the right signals, and that's going to attract these investments in a good way. Once again, we are before in elections, we don't know the results, but more than changing perhaps the administration at the federal level or at the state levels, it's really about changing the reality. That's the most important signal that we as Brazil have to give to the world in the coming years.
Thank you very much.
Luciana, can I just add one thing to what you have to say, which
course.
is you describe it has to be a package, and I couldn't agree more. Obviously, from the perspective of addressing climate change, we have to do everything. So in that sense, it has to be done that way. But from a business and economic perspective, it's important to understand that most, if not all, these technology solutions, these initiatives, are actually connected, in that when one sector of the economy heads in this cleaner direction, it actually accelerates the other changes as well. And let me just give you a simple example. The more renewable energy you have in your grid, the more that you can electrify your grid for transportation, the more you can do it for green hydrogen, the more that you can do direct air capture. All these things are connected. And as you do each of those, it provides benefits to that cleaner grid. So it's really important to look at it as a connected, interconnected whole, not just within, let's just do a lot of solar and not think about the rest of it.
Absolutely agree.
Very good. Mark, going back to you, I would love to hear a little bit about the global institutional investors. What's their role here? What's their view on transition finance? What's their view on how to price it? You have been around the world. Give us a little bit of the perspective.
So first of all, I think it's important to understand that institutional investors are looking for a risk-adjusted return on capital. And as much as it's important for them to decarbonize their portfolios or measure the carbon footprint or have some sort of an ESG score associated with it, ultimately the job of investment leaders is to provide a sufficient return on capital to pay the pensions, the endowments, the family offices, et cetera, the insurance programs that they represent. And I think anyone who believes otherwise actually doesn't understand the purpose of that capital. I'm chair of the board of one of the large Canadian pension funds. Our job is to make sure that hundreds and thousands, if not millions of people have sufficient money to have financial security in their retirement. That is our job. Our job isn't to decarbonize the world. Our job isn't to create, lower degrees of temperature. Our job isn't to have clean water. Our job is to pay pensions. Now, don't be depressed about that. First of all, it's a noble job. And the two things aren't necessarily antithetical to one another. Because as you think about the risk of our investments, it's very long-dated capital. We're paying pensions 25, 30, 40 years from now. And when we make investments that will create a return to pay those pensions, we have to think about the risks associated with it. And we have to ensure that where we're spending that capital is in a way that A, is going to drive a return, but B, is not going to be particularly risky. And the more long-term the thinking is, the more that the value and values of the portfolio converge. And I like to say, if we were going to buy a piece of real estate here on the Hudson River, if our time horizon is 5 years, we probably don't care much about climate change. If your time horizon is 50 years, you better worry about you better worry about climate change, because your piece of real estate will literally be underwater. Your investment will be underwater physically if you don't pay attention to it. So as long-term investors think about what's happening in the world, they think about two things. They think about the risk to their portfolio that is a result of climate change. And they also think about what we were talking about earlier, the opportunity to make a return to help fund the transition. But if we think about it, for those of us who believe in the need to create a more sustainable world, if we don't understand that institutional capital is driven by risk-adjusted return, we're going to find that we're going to be unable to finance, and the amount of financing required is massive. We're going to be unable to finance the outcomes that we need. And so, in my view, this has to be viewed as an investment opportunity, but it's critically important that we apply the lens of the capital markets to what we are proposing. So it's great that we have new technologies that are coming to the fore. What can I earn on that technology? It's great that Brazil, for instance, has these fantastic endowments that might allow me to build a green hydrogen plant. But how do I know that won't be expropriated, or how do I know that I'll be able to enforce my security if something goes wrong, so that I can protect my investment? So the capital capital markets understand today much better than they did, not completely, but much better than they did, the risks associated, particularly in the long term. and they understand much better than they have in the past the opportunity, but we're not there yet in terms of being able to attract that capital. But capital is an amazing thing. It's like water, right? It will find its lowest. It will find the place where it can make the best return. It'll flow to the place where it can make the best return. And I happen to believe that some of the best returns are going to come from financing the transition, but it's got to be commercial, and there has to be a return associated with it.
That's a very good lead for my final question. Thank you so much. We are here to discuss the private sector. We want to have the private sector as an important role of these climate change debates and on bringing the solutions. And we want to bring the private sector from Brazil to that discussion. So my last question to all of you, we were talking about capital markets. What sort of advice would you give to our entrepreneurs, to our business leaders? Where are the opportunities? How the private sector can, based on everything that you just talked and about risk-return adjustment, where the private sector in Brazil should look at? Bruce, maybe you want to start.
So I'll come to the specific sectors in a second, which I touched on a few minutes ago. But I want to actually add on what Mark spoke on here, because it has to do with where capital is flowing for entrepreneurs. I think in most of so-called developed countries, the U.S. and Europe, I don't see at the moment a shortage of capital for this. In fact, if anything, there maybe is too much capital. The returns are low in things like solar and wind projects because there's so much darn capital trying to get into those projects, and it's driving down the returns on those projects. The real shortage of capital is in developing countries. And the challenge there, the shortage of capital around climate solutions in those countries, doesn't have much to do with the technologies or the solutions. It has to do with the challenges of making long-term investments in those locations. And we could spend a long time talking about that. But that's a huge challenge. When we look at capital flows that we need, the 100 to 150 trillion, and that comes from BCG, over the next 30 years, the real challenge is those capital flows in developing countries.
And it's all the things that underpin any type of investment. And so, hedging the real today is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult. But if you think about it, I have to pay pensions in Canadian dollars or US dollars. If there isn't a deep, liquid ability to hedge the real, the cost of my capital doesn't work, because I have to ultimately pay pensions in Canada. So something as simple as the depth of ability to efficiently hedge currency risk becomes incredibly important. Tax policy becomes incredibly important. Chile made some changes to its technicalities of its dividend distribution tax. It caused hundreds of basis points of increased cost for institutional investors to invest in Chilean infrastructure. And guess what? A couple hundred basis points, I'll put my money in San Diego as opposed to Santiago, right? And because so all of this has to work together. And frankly, and I'll be a little bit blunt, this has been the failure of Brazil. Brazil has always been the great investment hope that has never materialized. And it's never materialized not because there isn't opportunity, not because you don't have people and projects and technologies and an educated population. It hasn't materialized because capital flows have not been able to come to the country in a way that they believe they will actually make the return that they are promised in the long run. And so the risk premium is extraordinarily high. And so if I can build that hydro plant or that solar farm in Spain, or in Alberta, or in Arizona, I'll do it before the premium that I'm going to require to do it in Brazil makes it uneconomic. And that's a fact, unfortunately.
I think what you just said, Mark, resonates with a lot of us because it's really about how to de-risk, right? And the point, this point actually kind of touches on a quite sensitive but important thing, which is to displace the wrong guys, the rotten apples from our markets. So it doesn't matter if we, invest time, energy, resources into, for instance, sustainable forest management in the Amazon, if in the end of the day, the products coming from the concessions, the private sector concessions in the region will have to compete, and they will be out-competed in the market because there is illegal logging flooding the markets. That's the reality. So yes, we need a pipeline of solutions. Yes, we need a pipeline of great projects. This will have the potential to attract capital. But we need to work on the other side. We need to have a better business environment. And that takes governments, but also takes the private sector to draw the lines, to say this is wrong, this is right, and really talk more as an activist sometimes because it's necessary. So I think that's part of the conversation, and let's be bold about this. Let's face it, and some of you here have been doing this for a while. But there's a second point, which is not related to displacing the wrongdoers, I would say so, and the wrong practices from Brazil, which is related to those guys that are committed to net zero. I want to say something to you. Stop green wishing and build net zero integrity. Stop green wishing. It's not only about saying, one day we're going to get there. One day we're going to get to net zero. Oh, I'm doing this. It's 1% of my portfolio is green. It's not about 1%. It's about 100%. And I'm saying this because although I acknowledge that our vibrant group of businesses and investors and others that are willing, to take the risk and to do good things in Brazil, today there are only 13 companies, Brazilian companies, which have science-based targets aligned with a 1.5 degrees world. Only 13. Bravo, applause to those 13. I see one of those here. But we won't do the transition with 13 guys. We won't. It's really about a whole ecosystem. We need the first movers, right? But then we need the followers. We need to work with the laggards as well. So that's the role of coalitions. That's the role of, getting together the businesses, the NGOs, the scientists, the government, so on and so forth. And we got to do it together. So it's really about this. And my last comment, Luciana, is the following. A net zero economy is not a far-off vision for Brazil. It's really about doing it right now. And if we don't do it right now, we're going to, stand in the back looking at others, building their own things and, getting really where they need to go. Still, the world won't get to net zero without us, so let's do it.
Couldn't agree more. We have to work together. Bruce, I don't know if you want to say a final comment.
I want to add to Natalie's comment about greenwashing. Wishing. I like green wishing. I like that. So in my office, which is in this building just behind us here, on the wall, there's I cut out of the newspaper a big ad from earlier this year. It's a full-page ad for a company. I won't name the company. It's not a well-known company. Big ad. We're now net zero.
Wow.
And why is it on my wall? It's on my wall to remind me, as if I need to be reminded, that when it comes to these company actions, it's really important to be aware of the bullshit that's out there. It's virtually impossible to be net zero today. If you really want to be net zero, to buy carbon credits that are truly additional and really absolutely reducing. And by the way, the only way you can get to net zero today is through carbon credits, because everything we do emits greenhouse gases. that's generally $1,000 a ton if you can find them. It's very, very hard to get to truly be net zero, to honestly say we don't have any emissions. And so this is a real challenge. For Brazil and Brazilian entrepreneurs, there's enormous opportunity in nature-based solutions. No question about that. That is one of Brazil's most important assets and competitive advantages as an entrepreneur. But what I would say to entrepreneurs is be very careful of this. Be aware of this need for additionality. Without additionality, carbon credits mean nothing. And I don't hear a lot of talk about it among the firms focused on the area today. They're just sort of rushing in as if making a carbon credit and purchasing it, now we're net zero, we're good. We need to think long term. We need to think that this is a 30-year journey. We shouldn't be out there getting ahead of ourselves and saying, this is easy, we're done. We need to be realistic about it. But if you are realistic about it, the opportunity around these nature-based solutions is absolutely terrific.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you very much. Natalie, do you want to say final words?
Just something that I think I forgot to stress during our first round of conversations. When I mentioned that I really see Brazil's role as one of a norm setter, someone that will shape the policies that can be adopted by other countries, I think that also applies to carbon credits and to carbon pricing schemes as a whole. I think if we are the ones, particularly in relation to nature and forest-based credits, if we are the ones, building the standards and sharing this with the world, I think we're gonna get really ahead of the curve. So yeah, let's work together around that. It's not going to be easy at all. There are many pioneers in this area and in Brazil. And the issue is really how do we coalesce and be constructive in building this new set of norms that the world can adopt.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Mark, final words?
I'm an optimist. So I think the necessity will drive solutions. I think the capital is there, and I think the opportunity is there. It just takes hard work and a lot of persistence. But I'm an optimist.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you so much.